And so now I think it's really important, and probably the most exciting stuff, at least for me in this podcast, is that's to kind of talk about the studies that we're currently enrolling in across all of our sites. And so, Seth, I don't know if you want to kind of talk us through some of those studies.
Yeah, so we have different studies at each location throughout Vance Thompson Vision. Some of the studies are shared just with them being multi-site. And of course, we have studies that carry over just the broad range of eye care in general, cornea-specific studies, cataract-specific studies. And right now, there's a lot of attention that's been directed towards alternative treatments for Fuchs dystrophy. For example, we finished up just in the last couple of years a study that's investigating injectable medication into the eye that can help stimulate new and healthy growth of endothelial tissue. But now we're looking at potentially an even lesser invasive treatment for that. And you can almost think of it as a topical therapy that is meant to do the same thing. It's meant to try to stimulate healthy endothelial cell growth to replace the unhealthy non-functioning tissue that occurs in Fuchs dystrophy. And with a lot of these new treatments that are coming out, the goal, or the primary goal, is to give a patient a solution without having to rely on a cornea transplant as your one and only option. And that's something that can be extremely helpful down the road, because we have situations that are not the most common, but there's patients out there that just cannot support a corneal transplant. So then this is an entire area where it could be life-changing for somebody who needs this type of treatment. And then to keep on going down the cornea road, there's tons of research going on into epithelium on cross-linking still. Epithelium off is our kind of standard right now for cross-linking, but there's been tons of research going into epithelium on, and most people think it's the way of the future. It's just a way to stabilize keratoconus without having to subject the patients with as much blurry vision and discomfort as they would traditionally experience with epithelium off cross-linking. And then, of course, there's glaucoma studies, and that can fall into the categories of surgical and topical therapy. Different topical medications to help lower eye pressure, different implants to help lower eye pressure. Eye dose is a hot topic right now. That's been something that's been hot, where it's just received its FDA approval, but we were involved in those studies as well.
I think that we'll have a podcast in the future kind of teasing that up, talking all things iDose. We'll probably touch on a little bit of the clinical data that came out of that, and then maybe clinical applications. So sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to throw that out there.
Sure. And I don't want to get too deep into that, because yeah, like you said, there's going to be a podcast that's specifically talking about iDose and all about it, the ins and outs. A type of study that I think all of our VTV sites are typically involved in are IOL studies, whether it's multifocal toric lenses, new lenses that are on the market, new brands, new designs to lenses. And that's always very exciting for us to be a part of, because we get our hands on the newest technology, and we're able to potentially give our patients that newer technology before anyone else is able to actually get their hands on it.
I've got a question that I can kind of piggyback on there with IOL studies. I think it's interesting. How do you talk with a patient? And maybe this is a two-part question. What's a good candidate for research? Like, how do we know that a patient, outside of indication for treatment, and then two, how do you talk to that patient about being in research?
Yeah, so I would start that by how do you select a good patient for a clinical trial? Part of it is, you first and foremost, they have to be a good candidate for whatever you're focusing this treatment on. So they have to have the condition that is targeted by the medication, or they have to be a candidate for cataract surgery, and have no safety contraindications of actually being able to proceed with surgery. So there's other aspects of it too. If, in the case of glaucoma, a lot of these studies, they will be specifically looking at mild glaucoma or maybe moderate glaucoma. So they have to fall into that specific category of severity oftentimes. And then, if we want to get into exclusions, it can be are they taking any medications that could have known drug interactions? So, for example, a lot of IOL studies, patients can't be using medications that are known to affect pupil size because a lot of times you're using anterior segment photos to monitor the location, rotation possibly of the IOL. And if they're taking medications that could prevent them from dilating, then you're obviously not going to get great photos to document that long term.
That's a great point. I think for me, sometimes the biggest frustration comes in that exclusion criteria when enrolling patients. Because so often there's a patient who's going to be a great candidate for a certain study that we have. They've got the condition that's being, necessary for whatever study. But then in one tiny little line in the exclusion criteria, somehow they meet that. And that can be so frustrating from a clinical standpoint. And so it's like you have to take your clinical hat off and put on your research hat to remember that these studies are, trying to look at very specific endpoints. And so if that certain exclusion is going to impact the endpoint, then they are not a good candidate for the study. But my clinician hat just really, really has a hard time letting that go.
That's a good point to make because you'll have a study going on, you'll have a patient, and you'll want so badly for them to get in the study. And it's exactly what you said. The exclusion criteria is set for a reason, and we have to kind of follow that map to make sure that we are indeed including the intended patient base for that specific study.
That's right.
To keep going with potential exclusion criteria, oftentimes patients who have had previous ocular procedures, that can be an exclusion criteria. Accuracy of the data we might be gathering. A lot of times we're looking at, we're monitoring visual acuity afterwards. And if there's the presence of any sort of potentially progressive condition, whether it's macular degeneration or any corneal degenerative disorder, that can heavily influence the data that's gathered. So those patients, they unfortunately can't be included in a lot of these studies. And of course, there's I would call them universal exclusions that apply to pretty much most clinical trials and not just specifically in eye care. And probably the one that's going to be applied to everyone is any females specifically is if they're pregnant or nursing, because that falls into the ethical umbrella. It's not ethical to be including anyone who is pregnant or nursing in a clinical trial. And then beyond that, we get into the ideas of informed consent. And if somebody comes in and they are unable to provide informed consent, then you can't really put them in the trial. And that might have to do with cognitive features or whether or not they just are unable to consent due to their age. For example, if they're 17 years or under, technically you cannot get an informed consent. And then it depends on how the sponsor or possibly the FDA has designed that clinical trial, because sometimes if you are 17 or under, you can still partake in the trial, but you do need permission from both parents, and you may need to obtain, we call it assent, and it's not the same as consent. It's more specific to people who are underage, but in other words, the child still does have to agree to be a part of the trial, and they have to be mature enough to understand the trial and understand what they're required to do. Now, that may or may not be required. That is more dependent on the sponsor, possibly the FDA.
I think all of those are kind of great points when we're talking about, what patients are good candidates for studies. And then how does the conversation go when you find the patient who is meeting, with the chart review, some of those inclusion exclusions? How does that conversation go? Do you find patients are excited about participating in research? Do you find there's some hesitation?
Sometimes I would say that depends on personality in some ways. Sometimes the idea of research can shy somebody away. And a lot of times people will bring up a clinical trial, will explain it. And, the last thing we want is for someone to feel like they're, a guinea pig, or that they're being tested on. And we try to describe it or present it in a way that you are going to be receiving care. And if we put a lot of emphasis on this is important because it allows us to advance medicine. And you being a part of this trial, this can help someone else down the road receive very important care if they need it. And that can become more exciting to somebody. And with more patients that I have interacted with in clinical trials, I would say that for the most part, they actually enjoy being a part of it. And it just falls into that idea that they are a part of something new and they are helping advance medicine. And I think they do find that exciting. And then beyond that, if we're talking about a patient who is a good candidate for a specific treatment, but let's say maybe they can't afford the more traditional or approved treatment that would be otherwise available. Well, this is a really good way for them to actually gain access to the care that they need without having to potentially try to save up money for years while their condition is worsening. And then maybe by the time they actually can afford the treatment that they otherwise would have been required to have, you know, that it'd just be a much more unfortunate situation if their condition is progressed and you can't take that back. So this can allow patients access to care quicker than they would otherwise have to wait for.
I think you touched on a great point. You find that patients really, yes, there are patients who are hesitant and, want to make sure that, quote unquote, they aren't that guinea pig, but you do find that they are so eager to participate in something that's bigger than themselves. They're so eager to contribute to advancing medicine.
To bring on another point, and I tell all of our patients this too as we are discussing a specific study, but not only do sponsors choose us to be a part of their study, but we kind of have to choose the study back. We have the right and we have the ability to say, no, I don't think this is a good study for us. And that might be because we don't have the specific patient population that would allow us to be good enrollers for the study. But also, if we read through the protocol of the study and we think, I don't know if I would feel great enrolling patients in this specific study, well, then we'll probably turn that one away. And it allows me to be truthful in telling our patients that we would never include ourselves in a clinical trial that I would not myself tell someone like my father to be in, if he needed it.
That's a great point and a really important point for us here at Vance Thompson Vision.